They told me to move my boat or face Finzies, but they had no idea I didn't just own the dock. I owned the whole lake. Evan Mercer had always dreamed of a quiet life by the water. After years of city noise and cramped apartments, he finally found a small lakeside home, complete with a wooden dock and a vintage motorboat he had carried from childhood memories. Every morning, he imagined sipping coffee while mist curled above the water, the gentle ripple of the lake against his boat soothing his restless mind. But one bright morning, as he walked down to the dock, a crisp, official letter fluttered in the breeze. It was from the Homeowners Association, and it wasn't friendly. The HOA demanded that Evan remove his boat within 72 hours, citing community rules and aesthetic guidelines. Confused and frustrated, Evan realized this simple pleasure, the very thing he had dreamed of, was suddenly at the center of a legal and personal battle. He never expected. Evan Mercer had always dreamed of owning a little slice of nature, somewhere he could escape the chaos of city life and spend quiet mornings watching the sunrise over calm water. After years of saving and searching, he finally found the perfect lakeside property, modest home tucked away in a peaceful community, with a wooden dock stretching over a small, shimmering lake. The moment he first set foot on the dock, he could already imagine himself sipping coffee in the early hours. The mist rising from the lake and the gentle sound of water lapping against the shore. It was exactly what he had always wanted. Serenity, solitude, and a place to call his own. Evan had brought his small vintage motorboat along, a practical and sentimental choice. He had grown up on a riverbank as a child, learning how to fish, paddle, and navigate small waterways. The boat represented more than just leisure. It was a connection to memories of summers spent with his father. Feeling the thrill of the water and the freedom it gave him, he placed it carefully on the dock, secured it with a strong rope, and admired the way it floated lightly, almost like it belonged there. For Evan, everything felt perfect, the calmness of the lake blending seamlessly with the quiet of his new home. He had been living there for only a few weeks, when the first unusual sign arrived. One crisp morning, as he strolled down to the dock to prepare for a fishing trip, he noticed a piece of paper flapping in the light breeze, taped firmly to the railing. Curious, he bent down and picked it up, instantly recognizing it as a formal notice. The bold, official-looking letterhead bore the name of the Homeowners Association, the HOA that managed rules and regulations for the lakeside community. Evan had been aware of the HOA when he purchased the home, but he had never imagined it would intervene in something as simple as his boat being tied to his own dock. He unfolded the letter with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, and as he read, his confusion grew. The HOA informed him that his boat violated community aesthetic guidelines and demanded that he remove it from the lake within 72 hours. The tone of the letter was strict and unyielding, leaving no room for negotiation or discussion. It felt aggressive for something so seemingly harmless. Evan reread the letter multiple times, trying to make sense of it. He had thought that living on a lake meant he could enjoy it in his own way. After all, the dock and the land it was attached to were part of his property. How could an organization that didn't own the lake tell him he had to move his boat? He looked out across the water where his boat floated peacefully, seemingly unaware of the bureaucratic storm it had just entered. The notice seemed absurd against the tranquil backdrop of the lake, where ducks paddled lazily and dragonflies danced above the surface. Evan's mind raced. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA had misread the property lines, or assumed the lake was part of the community's shared space. He decided to call a few neighbors to get their perspective, hoping someone could clarify whether he had made a mistake in docking his boat. The neighbors he spoke to were cautious, almost hesitant to take sides. They knew Marla Humphrey, the HOA president, was a stickler for rules and often enforced them with a kind of rigid zeal that intimidated most residents. Some offered sympathetic words, while others hinted at past incidents where the board had demanded residents remove minor personal items from their properties. Evan listened carefully, absorbing their experiences while trying to keep his own frustration in check. He could feel the tension rising. What should have been a simple, personal enjoyment of his property had suddenly become entangled in official regulations and power dynamics. He hadn't expected, despite the confusion. Evan decided to take a calm, measured approach. He spent the day organizing his paperwork, reviewing his property deeds, and preparing to address the situation in person. He wasn't the type to escalate conflicts unnecessarily. But he also knew he couldn't simply comply with a demand that seemed baseless. As he sat on the dock that evening, the sun casting a warm golden glow across the lake, he let himself imagine the confrontation ahead. He pictured the HOA meeting, the stern faces of board members, and Marla Humphrey pointing at rules he didn't recall agreeing to. Even so, Evan reminded himself that he had a right to enjoy his property and the peace it brought him. That night, as the stars reflected on the calm surface of the water, Evan felt a mix of determination and disbelief. He had worked hard to create a sanctuary, and now it seemed that the very place meant to give him solace was the center of a conflict he hadn't anticipated. Still, he resolved not to let intimidation dictate his actions. The boat wasn't just a vessel. It was a symbol of his freedom, his memories, and the simple joy of living by the water. He knew that standing up for it would require patience, careful planning, and perhaps even legal guidance. But Evan was prepared. The serene lake that had promised him peace now became a quiet battlefield, and he was ready to face the challenge. Armed with calm determination and the knowledge that he had the right to enjoy the place he now called home, Evan Mercer knew he could not ignore the HOA's notice. The letter had made it clear that the board expected him to remove his boat, and while Evan was patient by nature, he also understood that letting the issue slide might encourage them to push even further. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting in person. The thought of facing the board, especially Marla Humphrey, made him slightly uneasy. He had heard from neighbors that Marla was strict, commanding, and almost never open to discussion. Still, Evan reminded himself that he had purchased the property legally, with every necessary document in order, and he had done nothing wrong. On the day of the meeting, Evan dressed neatly and arrived a few minutes early. The HOA held its meetings in a small community hall at the edge of the neighborhood. Rows of folding chairs were arranged neatly, and a long table sat at the front where the board members were already seated, reviewing papers and whispering to each other. Evan could feel the tension in the room as he walked in. Most of the residents were already there, some with curious expressions, some with quiet apprehension. There was a low hum of conversation, and Evan could sense that everyone was wondering what the young new homeowner would say. When it was his turn to speak, Evan stood at the front, holding his own papers and taking a deep breath. He began politely, introducing himself and explaining that he had received the notice about his boat. He tried to present his case calmly without showing frustration. "I'm happy to follow community guidelines," he said, "but I'm unsure why my boat is considered a violation. It's tied to my dock on my property, and I believe that was allowed." Marla Humphrey, the HOA president, responded immediately, her voice firm and commanding. She insisted that the lake was part of the community property, and therefore all residents had to follow HOA rules regarding the use of the lake. She pointed to a section in the HOA handbook and described in detail how boats had to be stored, what types of vessels were allowed, and even how they should be tied to docks. Evan listened carefully, trying to make sense of her argument. She spoke with confidence, and he could see why some residents might feel intimidated. Several other board members nodded in agreement, reinforcing her point. "It's about consistency," one of them said. "We have rules to maintain the beauty and order of the neighborhood." Evan understood the importance of maintaining community aesthetics, but he still felt that the rules didn't apply to him in this particular case. The room felt tense, and some neighbors avoided eye contact, while others gave him small, encouraging nods. Evan realized he had to remain composed. Even as he felt frustration rising inside him, he tried to explain his understanding of property ownership, carefully mentioning that his deed might suggest something different regarding lake access. Marla dismissed it quickly, insisting that the HOA's interpretation was correct, and that any dispute would not affect the requirement to move his boat immediately. Evan could feel the unfairness pressing down on him. He realized that the board was acting more on assumption than on actual legal facts. It became clear to him that they had no idea who truly owned the lake. Despite feeling cornered, Evan remained calm. He didn't raise his voice or argue aggressively. Instead, he listened, asked clarifying questions, and took careful notes. He wanted to show that he was reasonable and respectful, even as the board seemed unwilling to consider his perspective. Around him, other residents whispered quietly, some clearly anxious about the confrontation, while others looked on curiously. A few people even seemed relieved that someone was finally standing up to Marla's strict enforcement of rules. After a tense half-hour of discussion, Evan realized that continuing the argument in the meeting was unlikely to yield results. Marla and the board members seemed determined to enforce their interpretation of the rules, and Evan didn't want to waste time in a fruitless debate. He decided to gather his documents, including his property deed and related paperwork, and leave the meeting. He planned to review them carefully at home and consult with a lawyer if necessary. As he walked out of the hall, he could feel the eyes of the community on him, some supportive, some judging. But he remained focused on his next steps. Back at home, Evan felt a mix of frustration and determination. He knew the HOA had acted without full knowledge of the property rights involved. Their confidence and authority at the meeting had been intimidating, but he reminded himself that facts and documentation mattered more than bold statements. Sitting by the lake, he watched his boat floating gently in the water, secure and unaffected by the conflict. The contrast between the serene environment and the tension he had just experienced made him even more determined to get to the bottom of the issue. He began organizing all his purchase documents. Searching for any reference to lake ownership or water rights, he reviewed old property maps, the original deed, and even historical records from the local county office. Every detail mattered. Evan was methodical and patient, taking notes, highlighting sections, and preparing a clear understanding of his legal position. The process was time-consuming, but he found himself feeling a strange satisfaction in uncovering every detail. It was almost like a puzzle, one that he needed to solve, not just for himself, but to protect his enjoyment of the property he had worked so hard to acquire in the following days. Evan spoke with a few neighbors quietly, without stirring too much attention. Some offered words of encouragement, sharing their own minor disputes with the board. Others admitted they had felt powerless when Marla enforced arbitrary rules. They seemed impressed that Evan was willing to stand up respectfully. These conversations gave Evan confidence. He realized he was not alone in feeling that the HOA's strict enforcement sometimes went beyond reason, and that his determination could make a difference by the end of the week. Evan had collected enough information to feel prepared for the next step. He was ready to take the time needed to carefully review legal documents and understand the true ownership of the lake. The confrontation at the HOA meeting had been challenging, but it also gave him clarity. He could see the board's overconfidence and assumptions, and he knew that with patience, he could demonstrate the reality of the situation. Sitting on his dock, the water reflecting the late afternoon sun, Evan felt a renewed sense of purpose. His boat remained where it had always been, calm and steady, a symbol of the peaceful life he was determined to protect. Evan understood that the confrontation was only the beginning. The HOA had made their position clear, but he now had the tools and mindset to address the misunderstanding properly. He felt ready to uncover the facts, present them carefully, and assert his rights without unnecessary conflict. While the meeting had been tense and frustrating, it also taught him the value of preparation, patience, and staying composed even in the face of unjust authority. Above all, it reminded him why he had moved to the lake in the first place, to enjoy freedom. Nature and the quiet confidence that came from knowing he had worked hard to secure this special place for himself. Evan Mercer sat at his dining table, papers spread out in a careful mess around him. The confrontation with the HOA had left him with more questions than answers, but he was determined not to let confusion or intimidation dictate what he could do with his own property. The meeting had made one thing very clear. The HOA was confident in its authority over the lake, and Marla Humphrey, the board president, would not listen to reason. Yet something inside Evan told him that the truth about the lake was hidden somewhere in the fine print of his purchase documents, and he was ready to find it. He began with the property deed he had received when buying the lakeside house. As he examined the thick pages, his eyes traced the printed words slowly, carefully, line by line. There were descriptions of the property boundaries, measurements of the land, references to adjacent lots, and legal jargon that often seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Yet, somewhere within those formal statements, Evan suspected, lay the key to resolving this conflict. He read through each paragraph multiple times, highlighting anything that mentioned water rights or lake access. Hours passed, and Evan felt like a detective piecing together a mystery. He recalled the early days when he had purchased the property and had glanced through the closing documents quickly, assuming the lake was part of the communal HOA amenities. Now, with the HOA asserting ownership over something that seemed unquestionably his to enjoy, he knew he needed to be meticulous. His instincts told him there had to be some historical record of the lake's ownership, something that predated the formation of the HOA and clarified who truly had legal authority over the HOL. Water. He pulled out an old folder from the closing documents and discovered references to a water rights agreement dating back to 1912. Evan's heart began to race. The document was a handwritten, typeset agreement that detailed the ownership of the lake and the rights of the landowners surrounding it. According to this agreement, the lake was not a shared community asset controlled by an organization like the HOA. Instead, ownership had been granted to the specific lot owners, passed down through property transfers over the decades. Every mention of community control that the HOA relied on in its handbook seemed to vanish under the weight of this old, but legally binding document. Excited yet cautious, Evan contacted his real estate attorney to verify his interpretation. He explained the situation calmly, providing copies of the original deed, the closing documents, and the 1912 water rights agreement. The attorney reviewed the papers carefully, confirming what Evan had suspected. Legally, held the rights to the lake as part of his property, and the HOA had no claim over it. Evan listened to the confirmation with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For years, he had assumed the HOA's authority was absolute in this matter, unaware that decades of assumptions and overlooked documentation had created a false narrative as he digested the news. Evan began to feel a sense of vindication, but also responsibility. The lake was technically his property, yet he had no desire to restrict his neighbor's enjoyment unnecessarily. He thought about the HOA meeting, about the fear and confusion in the eyes of some residents, and about Marla Humphrey's confident insistence that they controlled what happened on the water. It became clear that the HOA's authority had been a combination of misunderstanding, overconfidence, and unchecked assumptions. Evan realized that while he could now assert his legal rights, he also had an opportunity to correct the situation without creating unnecessary hostility. Over the next few days, Evan spent hours organizing his evidence, preparing a clear presentation of the facts, and thinking about how he would communicate the truth to the HOA. He knew that presenting old legal documents to people who had long believed the lake was theirs would be challenging. He anticipated resistance, skepticism, and perhaps even attempts to discredit the documents. He also knew that he needed to remain calm and professional, demonstrating that he was not trying to create conflict, but simply asserting the reality of ownership. Evan also took time to reflect on his own goals. He had not moved to the lake to start a legal battle or to upset the community. His goal was simple: to enjoy his property and his boat without interference. Yet the process of uncovering the lake's history had deepened his appreciation for the place. He imagined his father teaching him to fish in the calm waters, the mornings spent rowing while the mist hovered above the surface, and the peaceful solitude that had first drawn him to the lake. This personal connection made the fight more meaningful. He realized that he wasn't just protecting a property right, he was protecting a sanctuary, a connection to nature, and a lifelong dream finally realized. In the evenings, Evan would sit on the dock, surrounded by piles of papers, reflecting on the history he had uncovered. He imagined the lake as it had been a century ago, owned and cared for by private individuals, a quiet jewel in the midst of a developing neighborhood. The thought that Marla and the HOA had unknowingly attempted to control something that was never theirs amused him, even as it frustrated him. He could almost picture the look on her face when he would finally reveal the truth, confident yet polite. Armed with evidence that could not be disputed, Neighbors began noticing his late-night research sessions, and a few approached him cautiously, curious about what he was doing. Some offered their own insights, having lived in the area for decades, but most were unaware of the historical water rights. A few whispered that Marla had often acted as though she ruled the lake herself, enforcing arbitrary rules without considering the legal reality. Evan nodded quietly, not wanting to reveal too much, but appreciating the moral support. These small interactions reminded him that he was not alone in his desire for fairness and clarity. By the end of the week, Evan felt prepared. He had reviewed all relevant documents, verified them with legal counsel, and organized them into a coherent package that clearly established his ownership of the lake. The confirmation from his attorney had solidified his confidence. The HOA could no longer rely on assumptions or past misunderstandings. Evan felt a sense of quiet triumph. He had uncovered the truth through patience, research, and attention to detail. And now he was ready to address the situation directly. Evan realized that the discovery had changed the dynamic entirely. He no longer approached the HOA from a position of uncertainty or fear. He was armed with facts, history, and legal authority. The challenge now was how to communicate the information in a way that was respectful, persuasive, and undeniable. He planned to draft a formal letter, present copies of the documents, and politely assert his rights over the lake. He also intended to clarify the situation for the benefit of the entire community, ensuring that future disputes could be avoided. As he looked out over the calm water, Evan felt a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. The boat he had once feared might be forced off the lake remained where it belonged, gently bobbing in the sunlight. The lake itself, now understood to be his property, represented not just a personal victory, but a restored sense of order and justice. Evan knew the next steps would require careful communication and patience. But he also knew that he had uncovered a truth that could not be ignored. The quiet triumph of discovery, combined with the peaceful beauty of the lake, left him feeling confident, empowered, and ready to face whatever challenges came next. Evan Mercer knew that gathering the documents and confirming his ownership of the lake was only half the battle. The real challenge now was to confront the HOA in a way that was firm but calm, respectful yet undeniable. He spent hours drafting a letter, carefully choosing every word to ensure clarity and precision. The letter began politely, acknowledging the HOA's role in maintaining community standards. But it quickly moved to the heart of the matter, the legal documents proving that Evan owned the lake's water rights. He attached copies of his property deed, the 1912 Water Rights Agreement, and the confirmation from his attorney, ensuring that every piece of evidence was organized and easily verifiable. After reviewing the letter multiple times, Evan felt confident. This was not a fight born of anger. It was simply a matter of clarifying the truth. He sent the letter via certified mail to the HOA, ensuring that it would reach the board members directly and that there would be a formal record of his communication. He also made copies for himself, arranging them neatly in a folder labeled Lake Ownership Documents. Sending the letter gave him a sense of relief, but it also brought a little nervous excitement. He knew the moment of confrontation was coming, and he wondered how the board would react when faced with undeniable proof they had been wrong all along. Within a few days, the HOA called an emergency meeting. The notice arrived at Evan's door with the usual official letterhead and signatures, but this time, the tone was different. There was a tension in the air that even casual neighbors seemed to notice. At the meeting, Evan arrived early as usual, setting up his folder of documents on the table before him. Board members whispered among themselves, and Marla Humphrey, the HOA president, looked visibly unsettled. Evan remained calm, taking a deep breath and reminding himself that he had done everything correctly. He was prepared to explain his case logically and professionally, without letting frustration or anger take over. As the meeting began, Marla tried to dismiss Evan's claims immediately. "These documents are outdated," she said, her voice sharp, "and they don't reflect current HOA policies. We have rules, and those rules must be followed." Evan waited until she finished speaking, then calmly presented his folder, opening it to the first document. He explained each piece in simple, clear terms, showing the deed, the historical water rights agreement, and the attorney's confirmation. "This shows that the lake is not community property," he said steadily. "It is legally part of my property, and I have the right to keep my boat where it has always been." A hush fell over the room. Board members leaned forward, examining the documents with growing concern. Some whispered to each other, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. Marla's confident demeanor began to falter as Evan walked through the history of ownership, highlighting each transfer of rights from the original 1912 agreement to his own purchase. It became increasingly clear to everyone in the room that the HOA had been operating under a false assumption for decades. Marla attempted to argue, insisting that the documents were somehow invalid or irrelevant, but Evan's attorney, who had accompanied him to the meeting, spoke up. The attorney explained the legal binding of the documents and affirmed their authenticity. The room was silent again as board members realized that their claims were unsupported and legally baseless. The power dynamic that had dominated previous meetings had shifted entirely. Evan remained composed, calmly answering questions and pointing out facts without confrontation. His patience and preparation gave him a quiet authority that could not be ignored. Neighbors in the room began to murmur among themselves. Some looked relieved, glad that the truth had finally been clarified. Others appeared shocked, realizing that the HOA had enforced rules over something they did not own. A few older residents even expressed gratitude to Evan, whispering thanks for correcting a long-standing misunderstanding. Evan felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. He had anticipated resistance, but seeing the truth recognized, even tentatively, was deeply validating. Marla, now visibly flustered, tried one last time to maintain control. She questioned minor points, attempted to interpret older language in the documents differently, and even implied that the HOA had some residual authority. Evan responded patiently, pointing to the specific clauses and legal interpretations confirmed by his attorney. Gradually, it became apparent that further debate was futile. The board's confidence had been based entirely on a misunderstanding, and Evan's well-prepared presentation had left them no room to assert control over the lake. By the end of the meeting, the HOA had no choice but to acknowledge the reality of Evan's ownership. While they did not issue a formal apology, the tone of their statements had shifted. Marla and other board members spoke more cautiously, avoiding further attempts to assert authority over the lake. Evan had not only defended his own rights, but had clarified the situation for the entire community, ensuring that future misunderstandings could be avoided. The atmosphere in the room changed from confrontation to reluctant acceptance, and Evan felt a quiet sense of triumph. After the meeting, Evan spent a few moments outside, taking in the peaceful view of the lake. The boat floated gently where it had always been, unaffected by the bureaucratic confusion that had surrounded it. The sun sparkled on the water, and Evan felt a profound sense of relief. Not only had he secured his rights, but he had done so in a way that respected the community and maintained civility. It was a victory born of preparation, patience, and calm persistence, rather than aggression or anger. Over the next few days, neighbors approached Evan to congratulate him quietly. Some admitted they had been intimidated by the HOA in the past, and they thanked him for standing up for what was right. Others expressed curiosity about the documents and the history of the lake, which Evan shared with patience and humor. He began to feel a renewed sense of connection to the community, not through submission to authority, but through clarity and honesty. His relationship with his neighbors improved, as people appreciated both his courage and his fairness. Evan also took steps to formalize the understanding going forward. He drafted a simple, clear notice to the HOA, outlining the ownership of the lake and the legal rights involved. He offered to allow reasonable access for residents to enjoy the water, but made clear that any future regulations would require his approval. This approach balanced firmness with generosity, ensuring that the community could continue to enjoy the lake without confusion or conflict, while also protecting Evan's legal rights. Sitting on his dock one evening, watching the sunset reflect on the water, Evan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The lake, once the source of tension and uncertainty, had become a symbol of perseverance, preparation, and fairness. His boat floated peacefully, a quiet reminder of what he had fought to protect. He realized that the confrontation had not only resolved the immediate conflict, but had also strengthened his confidence in dealing with challenges. He knew that standing up for what was right required patience, knowledge, and calmness. And this experience had taught him those lessons in a profound and unforgettable way. After the confrontation with the HOA, Evan Mercer felt an unexpected mix of relief, satisfaction, and a little amusement. The documents he had carefully gathered, the property deed, the 1912 water rights agreement, and the attorney's confirmation had made an undeniable case. The once confident HOA board, led by Marla Humphrey, had no choice but to accept the truth. Evan owned the lake. What had begun as a frustrating, intimidating challenge had transformed into a quiet victory that not only secured his rights, but also brought clarity and fairness to the entire neighborhood. In the days following the meeting, the atmosphere in the community shifted subtly. Neighbors who had once been quiet or hesitant around the HOA now approached Evan with curiosity and gratitude. Some admitted they had felt intimidated by Marla's strict enforcement of arbitrary rules and thanked Evan for standing up respectfully. Others were fascinated by the history of the lake, eager to learn about the century-old water rights that had been overlooked for so long. Evan welcomed the conversations, sharing the story in simple, relatable terms. He found that most people responded positively, relieved that the long-standing confusion had finally been resolved. Evan also realized that this newfound understanding brought a sense of responsibility. Owning the lake did not mean excluding others. He wanted to maintain harmony in the neighborhood. He decided to set reasonable guidelines for access, ensuring that residents could continue enjoying the lake, fishing, boating, or simply relaxing by the water. But with respect for his property rights, he drafted a simple notice to the HOA and the community explaining the ownership, clarifying the rules, and encouraging neighbors to enjoy the lake responsibly. His tone was friendly and inclusive, balancing firmness with generosity. Marla Humphrey and other board members, while initially embarrassed by their mistake, began to accept the new reality. Marla, in particular, had to adjust her approach. For years, she had wielded authority over lake usage with confidence. Now she had to recognize that any future decisions regarding the water would require Evan's approval. Though she tried to maintain her composure, it was clear that the power dynamic had shifted. The incident became a quiet lesson for the board about humility, due diligence, and the dangers of making assumptions. Evan, however, handled the situation with grace, avoiding personal confrontation and focusing, instead, on clear communication and fairness. The change in dynamics had an unexpected effect on the community. Other residents, who had often been cautious or intimidated, began to feel more empowered to speak up in HOA meetings about minor issues. Evan's respectful, yet firm approach demonstrated that knowledge, preparation, and calmness could resolve conflicts effectively. People started to view him as a reliable and firm-minded neighbor, someone who could navigate disputes without unnecessary tension. This increased trust made social interactions in the community more open and positive. Meanwhile, Evan continued to enjoy the lake as he had imagined when he first purchased the property. His boat, the centerpiece of the dispute, remained securely tied to his dock, floating gently in the sunlit water. He spent mornings rowing and fishing, afternoons watching the sunlight dance on the water's surface, and evenings sitting quietly, listening to the soft sounds of nature. The lake, once a source of stress, had returned to being a place of peace and personal fulfillment. Every ripple of the water reminded him of the patience and effort it had taken to resolve the issue, and he appreciated the tranquility, even more because he had earned it. Evan also began reflecting on the broader lessons from the experience. He realized that disputes are often fueled not just by conflict, but by misunderstanding and lack of information. The HOA had acted with confidence based on incorrect assumptions, and it had taken careful research, documentation, and calm communication to correct the error. Evan saw the importance of knowledge and preparation in asserting one's rights, and he appreciated the quiet power of doing so without aggression. He felt proud that he had approached the situation with integrity, setting an example for others in the neighborhood. The resolution of the lake issue also strengthened Evan's sense of connection to the community. Neighbors began seeking his advice on minor property questions, and some even invited him to participate in community events and informal gatherings by the lake. He found that a combination of authority grounded in knowledge, fairness, and patience earned respect far more effectively than confrontation or arrogance. The lake, which had initially been a point of contention, had become a shared symbol of clarity, trust, and cooperation, with Evan at the center as a steady, firm-minded figure. As weeks passed, Evan took additional steps to formalize the understanding. He worked with his attorney to create a brief, clear agreement outlining the lake's ownership and usage guidelines, ensuring that the situation could not be misinterpreted in the future. Copies were shared with the HOA and residents, providing transparency and preventing further confusion. This proactive approach not only reinforced his legal rights, but also showed neighbors that he valued community harmony. Evan's calm, rational handling of the situation earned quiet admiration from many who had observed the conflict unfold. Evan also reflected on the personal growth he had experienced through the ordeal. At first, the HOA's notice had been stressful, even intimidating, and he had questioned how to respond without escalating the situation. By remaining calm, researching the facts, and presenting evidence respectfully, he had achieved a satisfying resolution. He realized that patience, preparation, and integrity are powerful tools in navigating challenges. The experience deepened his confidence and strengthened his ability to handle unexpected problems, both within the neighborhood and in life more broadly. Even Marla Humphrey, despite initial frustration, eventually adapted to the new reality. She learned to consult Evan for decisions involving the lake, gaining first-hand experience in navigating authority and ownership boundaries respectfully. The board collectively became more cautious and diligent, realizing that assumptions and unchecked confidence could lead to embarrassment or error. Evan's approach had not only secured his own rights, but had also helped the HOA grow more responsible and aware of the actual legal and historical realities of their community. Evan's peaceful mornings on the dock, watching his boat float gently and listening to the calm lapping of water against the shore, became a daily reminder of the journey he had undergone. What had started as a frustrating and intimidating conflict had turned into a personal victory and a broader lesson for the community. The lake, once a point of tension, was now a symbol of fairness, patience, and quiet authority. Evan felt gratitude not only for owning the lake, but also for the experience, which had taught him the importance of preparation, respect, and calm perseverance. In the end, Evan's victory was not just about legal ownership of the lake or keeping his boat in place. It was about asserting his rights without losing his composure, about balancing firmness with generosity, about transforming a source of stress into a lasting source of peace and satisfaction. The neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson. The HOA had adjusted its approach, and Evan had reclaimed the tranquil enjoyment he had envisioned when he first moved to the lake. His boat remained where it belonged. The water reflected the golden light of the sun, and Evan Mercer at last could relax fully, knowing he had protected both his property and his peace of mind.